Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. Glad you can come and be with us. It's been a little dreary outside today, but it's been a good day to be together and worship God. I wanted to speak with you tonight a little bit about a subject that I've struggled some with, that has, even at times, been a challenge to my faith. And if it's been a challenge to mine, it's probably been a challenge to some of you as well. And this is the idea of suffering. And in particular, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are so many people dealing with suffering? And what does God have to do with that? And so this question is often asked, how can a loving God allow so much suffering in the world? All these things that we see are happening around us with illnesses, people getting hurt, people getting shot, people with emotional issues that do harmful things to other people. And sometimes we might say, why God? Why are you allowing this to happen? I've heard people say it. I've heard people use that as a reason not to believe in God. Some choose not to believe in God because of it. Some have lost their faith because of it, things that have happened. Charles Darwin's oldest daughter, Annie, was stricken with scarlet fever when she was 10, and she died. His wife was religious, and he was, to some extent, and something I read said that he even had considered becoming a preacher. But he blamed God for her death and never got over it. And we know the rest of the story about what he became. When I was, it's been several years ago now, I went through some serious health issues. I mentioned it maybe before. And it started out with, I had a blockage that was in my common bile duct, which caused me to start having liver failure. It was worsened by when I went and had a procedure done, a medical procedure that then gave me acute pancreatitis on top of the problem that I already had. Now, one of those in and of itself was bad enough, but you put two of them together, well, it's worse. And so during that time, during the next several weeks in the hospital, going through different procedures, dealing with the pain of those ailments, I learned something about suffering physically. It became, something that many times I didn't think I would get over. Morphine became my friend, all right? And I was looking forward to the next time the nurse would come in with that. And during the months that followed, it took many months to recover. I spent a lot of time sitting, thinking, not being able to do anything, being depressed. Sometimes I asked God, why is this happening? And I asked these questions, right, that we're talking about. And so, but after time, I did recover. And I do believe God blessed me with that recovery. I'm standing here before you today. But I thought about this some more, and I started thinking about it more deeply and did some study on it. And I came up with some ideas that helped me to think about it. And so I developed this lesson, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it this evening, and maybe it'll help you a little bit. It helped me. So the first question I'll ask is, why didn't God create a world without all this evil and suffering in it? And the obvious answer might be, He did. Right? He created the world. It says in Genesis 1:31, then God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. God created a perfect world, and He put man and woman in it. And God sustained it. God created a perfect world that was maintained by His sustaining power. This is one of the concepts that kind of helped me to think through this. God was able to sustain Adam and Eve, the garden, everything that was in it with no deterioration. Right? But we know what happened to that. Right? Let me see if I can get my slide to work here. This is what happened, right? To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception and pain, and you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then he said to Adam, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake, and toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and for dust you will return. So God kicked man out of the garden. He decided not to sustain man any longer based on his sin. We know the story. God told them what they should do. They should take care of the garden. They can eat of the fruit of the tree of life. They were not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they sinned. And sin caused them to be cast out of the garden. And sin that was the beginning of the end, right, of the world in a way. So you might say, and some might say, well, that's not fair. Right? We're not responsible for their sin. We didn't do it. We weren't there. The Bible teaches that the son's not responsible for the sins of his father, and that's true. But we do suffer the consequences for other people's sins. We expect to suffer the consequences for our own mistakes. I mean, in some ways we do. Probably not when we sin, but later on, and we accept that we did something. We have consequences for it. But it's really hard when we have to have the consequences for what someone else has done. But I believe that we still live with the consequences, right, of man's sin. Not our own, but the consequences of the original one. So we know that there were two things that happened. One was that spiritual death happened to mankind. They were separated from God. Before this, they were able to speak with God, to walk with God, to be with God, and we understand that spiritual death happened. They were separated. But also physical death, in that men were not going to be able to have access to the tree of life anymore. They weren't going to live forever, and therefore they were going to return to dust. We were going to die. So in sin into the world, we see suffering, pain, death followed that sin. And in those verses that I just read, you can see all of that. Right? You can see suffering in there. You can see pain in there. You can see death in there. So God no longer used all of his power to fully sustain the earth and man anymore. And then things began to deteriorate. Man's body began to deteriorate. The earth began to deteriorate. And again, that was the beginning of the end of the earth. So as I thought about this, I thought about this question, and it relates back kind of to that, is all suffering directly or indirectly caused by sin? And I went about trying to answer this question, and I'm not going to say that I have all the answers to this question or to this idea of suffering. But as I thought about this, I came up with these two different ways of looking at suffering. The first way is moral suffering. So much of the suffering, and I made up these words, so they may not fit great, but moral suffering is this idea or this concept that suffering is caused by our actions or by the actions of people. Okay? So suffering caused by things that we do, consequences that we have to deal with because of what we've done, or consequences of what someone else has done. Okay? So moral choices causes suffering. And so I think if you think about it for a little bit, right, that's a lot of the suffering. Right? There's a lot of the suffering that happens in this world is based on choices that people make. The other thing that I thought about was this idea of natural suffering. Again, I don't know if that's the best word, but because God removed his sustaining power and things began to deteriorate, when scientists look at this and they try to figure out, what's happening? Why is the world sort of falling apart? And the universe seems to be going away from something that was more organized to less organized. Not a surprise to us. Right? We understand what's happening to the world and what's God's plan is for the world. So I want to talk a little bit more about these two things. So moral suffering, again, this concept of suffering caused by our own sins or other sins. Suffering because, here's a few examples. Do children suffer if their parents make bad decisions and bad choices? Does a husband or a wife suffer because of their spouse makes bad choices or bad decisions or sins? What about how many people have suffered at the hands of evil people? People that have decided to do evil things like happened recently. Or even someone like Adolf Hitler, an evil person. How many people suffered because of what he has done or did? The terrorists that we see, ISIS, evil rulers that are in place right now, where that they fare just fine and their people starve. Okay? It causes a lot of suffering in the world. What about this though? What about things like hunger? What about diseases? I thought about this as well. What about, world hunger? There are people that are starving in this world. And then I did some research on this and found out that we actually produce enough food to feed 3,000 calories to every person on the planet. So the question then is, if they're suffering because of hunger, whose fault is it? Does God have anything to do with that? Or is that our fault? Or is that humans' fault? Also, decisions that we make and sins that we commit can cause all kinds of problems in our physical bodies as well. All the man-made pollutions and chemicals and things that we put on everything and that we take into our body and the foods that we eat, and we can't even avoid them. I wonder how these things are affecting us and what is the effect on our body. The idea of natural suffering then is this idea that the whole world is deteriorating. Right? We know that God has a plan for the world, and the world is going to be burned up with fire in the end when God decides it's time. We also have things like natural disasters. We've been through a lot of hurricanes. It wasn't that many years ago that there was you remember the massive tsunami, killed 200,000 people. These aren't acts of God. Okay? People sometimes call them acts of God. They're not acts of God. They're consequences of a world without God. That God's no longer protecting, that He's no longer sustaining. Another aspect about disease, so we talked about that, is that a lot of scientists now believe that most diseases are genetic in nature. There's some kind of genetic component. And we see a lot of treatments that are coming out now, genetic treatments for cancer and for other things. Okay? And so one of the things that they've also noticed is that over time, there's a deterioration in the human genome. So our genes are deteriorating right through each generation. There's getting problems in them and mistakes and errors, and these things are getting worse. Not really surprising either when we think about it in this way, right? Technological advances can hold off some of these. We've got, I've been through like 2 or 3 things now in my life that would have killed me 100 years ago. All right? But I'm still here because of the medical technologies that we have, and we can hold it off. And I've held it off. We've held it off for me for a little while now, but guess what? We're not going to be able to. Okay? Not permanently. Genesis 3:19 says, to dust we must return. That's what God tells us is going to happen, and that's what will happen. So what about suffering in the Christian? So if we think about these things, does this help us at all? Okay, and so maybe at first glance, maybe it doesn't help us, especially when we're going through the suffering. So I know that when we're in the depths of suffering, or our loved one is, that it's very difficult to see anything outside of that. Okay, it's very difficult. But when we think about what really God has done for us, right, and we think about what we've done and what has been done by others, we can't blame God and just give up our faith. Some have done that. And that's not what God wants us to do. That's not what we should do. It's what Satan wants us to do. Right? We all know the story of Job. Right? He thought Job would do that. What happened to Job? Job had everything, right? He was healthy, nice family, wealthy. Satan went up to, was negotiating basically with God and said, the only reason why Job is so faithful is because of all the good things you've given him. Look at all he has. Satan said, if you'll take these things away, he'll turn against you. God said, okay, well, you can take away all of his things, but just don't harm his body. So all of Job's things were taken away, right? His family, his wealth. He still didn't turn against God. Then Satan went back to God and said, no, well, it's because he's not sick, right? If you take away his health, then he's going to turn against you. But we know he didn't. Okay? Now there's been, I know some of you in this audience, definitely know some of you went through a lot of suffering in your life. And I went through a little, but I'm not sure about compared to Job. Right? It's like he had all my medical issues and then he lost everything else too. Suffering's not good. Okay? As far as I can tell, the suffering itself, right, is not good. But some good can come from our response to that suffering. And I've seen a lot of that when I went through some of my health issues. There was a time when I was pretty sure I wasn't going to make it. They wheeled me over into, actually it was a different part of the hospital than the one I was in. It was about midnight. I was on a stretcher laying there. It was dark in the room. It was just like me and the technician. They were going to do another CT scan on me. And I was laying there, incredible pain, was having trouble breathing. They'd already told me that the bottom lobes of my lungs had collapsed, and that's why I was having trouble breathing. And I really thought I got about 2 breaths left. All right, this is probably it. And I'll tell you that you get a clarity, right? If anyone's been sort of in that situation, to focus on what's really important. Right? And the only thing I thought about at that time was my relationship with God, because I thought I was getting ready to meet him. And the second one was praying and asking God to take care of my family, because I had a wife and 4 kids at the time. And that was it, right? No other cares of the world. There wasn't anything else that I worried about or thought about. And so, at least at that time, total focus, right, on what's important in life. It reminds us of the brevity of life. It reminds us that, we're not going to live forever. We weren't made to live forever. Okay. We're made to go through this life, to serve God, and then we're going to return to dust. This world's not our home. Something else I've also experienced in my life as being part of a church family is the outpouring of help and support that anyone has whenever they go through some serious challenges. Okay? When anyone's suffering, we're suffering. Okay? We're reaching out to help them. We're talking to them. I experienced this help for me and my family beyond what anything I could even imagine from brothers and sisters in Christ. So being a part of this family, it gives us opportunities to show our love for one another, and the one that's suffering receives those gifts or whatever what someone is giving them or helping them with. But you know what? The one that has the opportunity then to give, right? They're laying up treasures in heaven. So it's actually that suffering, even though that it's hard to deal with, the people that are helping, right? That's a benefit to them in their spiritual life. In the end, we know God's going to make things right? We see some examples in the Bible. There are many. The rich man and Lazarus. The rich man had everything he ever wanted. He died and went to torment. Lazarus begged, had sores on his body. He died and went to paradise. We see some of the sufferings that Paul went through. Right? I wrote them down. There's such a list. Paul was tortured, beaten, imprisoned, stoned, shipwrecked, robbed, had infirmities, was cold, hungry, every persecution basically imaginable, Paul endured. But he knew there was something waiting for him. He knew that this life was not all there is. He knew there was a crown of life waiting for him. In Romans 8:18 it says, "For I consider the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us." What about Jesus? Take just a moment to kind of take in some of these words on the overhead here that describe some of the things that Jesus went through. Have we been through some of those? We probably have. Have we been through all of them? Probably not. Jesus understands what it's like to suffer. He's been through all the things that we go through. He's been tempted in all the ways that we are. And it helps him understand what is going on with us. And why is that? Why did he have to suffer? Here's a few reasons. One, to show us the consequences of our sin. The consequences of our sin is the reason why that Christ had to die. To help us understand the love of God. God loved us so much that he sent his Son to suffer all these things and to die for us. It also made him the perfect high priest for us, the perfect mediator, because he understands what we're going through and he can mediate between us and God. And also to be an example for us when we suffer. He suffered, but he was a perfect example. He didn't turn away from God. He didn't turn away from what he was supposed to do. And he became our perfect example in everything that we do. Sort of in conclusion, there will be an end to all suffering. We know that there's going to be an end to it. At least for the faithful Christian, we know there's going to be an end to suffering. In Revelation 21, starting in verse 1, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away." So we know in the end that God's going to take care of us. There is an end to whatever suffering that we're going through. There's tremendous suffering in the world. Every day we see it on the news. But God knows about it. God knows about every moment of suffering that we go through. He still cares about us. He wants us to overcome. But more than anything, he wants us to come to heaven, to be in heaven with him. And that's what our goal is. What Job knew, what Paul knew, and what we know is that this is not our home. All right? What we just mentioned is our home. Our home's going to be with God. Appreciate your attendance tonight and your patience listening. If there are any here tonight that need to obey the gospel,